Hi, I'm Sarah Kessler, and I am here to read my essay, The Politics of Involuntarity, A Personal History of Ventriloquism. Hey! I'm 12 years old, standing on a carpeted stage in front of 100 people, singing in a language I don't understand. I'm wearing a white dress with a large lace ruffle that covers my flat chest. My brown page boy looks unbrushed, even though it isn't. I'm flanked by two gray-haired, middle-aged men. One stands on either side of my androgynous adolescent body. The words I'm singing are hand-printed in ink on a large, ornately decorated scroll that lies on the podium before me. As I project the words into the cavernous space of the auditorium in my lilting tween soprano, I use a strange device that looks a bit like a back scratcher to follow the text. My hand holds a lacquered wood dowel whose end is another smaller metal hand. Its index finger points at each word I am to vocalize. I sing for what feels like hours. I'm 15 and I'm reading the longest book I've read to date. Every night before I fall asleep, I read a single dense page. When after months of reading the book finally ends, I feel like my best friend has gone missing. My mother, who bought me the book, has told me that this book is controversial and that its author has received death threats. Not just death threats, he is the subject of something called a fatwa, which means he could be killed at any moment. Luminaries like Susan Sontag are defending him, actively trying to lift the price from his head. I grasp only the vague outlines of the situation. I grasp only the vague outlines of the book, except for one scene in which it is revealed that the person transcribing the words of a religious leader who professes to have a direct line to God is subtly altering these words as he commits them to paper. God's conduit, the prophet, passes the words through his own conduit, the scribe. At every turn, the words shift. The distinction between speaker and vessel blurs. If my poor words could not be distinguished from the revelation by God's own messenger, then what did that mean? What did that say about the quality of the divine poetry? There is no bitterness like that of a man who finds out he has been believing in a ghost. I'm 21, sitting in a college classroom. The desks are arranged in a semicircle. Each is occupied by a fashionably dressed peer who I'm convinced understands the readings much better than I do. The professor is young and hip and brilliant. She keeps asking the question, what's at stake here? Every time the question is posed, a male student raises his hand and opens his mouth, eager to explain, I don't know, the relevance of cognitive mapping to contemporary geopolitics. I have no idea what is at stake. It dawns on me with no small amount of shame that I've never thought about anything in terms of stakes. That I can't say what's crucial about the novels we're reading or about the theoretical works we've been assigned. The latter feels especially pathetic since each theorist takes pains to explain their intervention and why it's so important. These theorists literally say what is at stake, and I still don't know what's at stake. I rarely speak in class, and when I do, I feel stupid. Luckily, I can make up for my speaking with my writing. We have to write blog entries on each of the readings. I never know what I'm going to say until I sit down to write, but it doesn't matter because something always comes out. When I read the entries after I've written them, I'm surprised by how insightful they are. It's as if someone else had those thoughts and I merely committed them to the page. That other person, the thinker, understands cognitive mapping and geopolitics. Theirs is a confident, self-assured, writerly voice. One night, I run into the hip young professor on the darkened street outside the department building, and when she makes out my face, she blurts out, "Your blog entries are fantastic," and keeps on walking. I think she must mean someone else. It is really very dark out, and she is in a hurry. She must be associating the wrong words with the wrong face. I'm 29, sitting in a graduate seminar on Middle Eastern literature. We're discussing a 20th century Iranian novella originally published in the 1930s. About half of my classmates are reading the book in Persian, and the rest, including me, are reading the text in English translation. We pause frequently to address discrepancies in meaning. The novella's narrator is a man who suffers from a crippling sense of existential dread. He experiences manic episodes, visual and auditory hallucinations. For example, he frequently hears the same ghoulish laugh emanating from different bodies. The laughter is mechanical, as if the people emitting it are wind-up toys. It's not clear how the laughter is related to the man's fever dreams, whether it's their cause or effect or something else. In the end, the man finds himself laughing, involuntarily expelling the same sound he's been hearing all along. I burst into laughter. It was a harsh, grating, horrible laugh which made the hairs on my body stand on end. For I did not recognize my own laughter. It seemed to come from someone other than me. I felt that it had often reverberated in the depths of my throat and that I had heard it in the depths of my ears. As a group, we ponder the significance of the laughter to the novella, whose title is not an auditory metaphor, but a visual one. What is at stake, I write later, and reflexively channeling the hip young professor, in the author's figuration of subjectivity as a hollow laugh whose deep resonance results from the vacuum at the core of its body of origin. And if we accept this figuration, is our only recourse, in view of the hollowness of our laughter, to identify with the mouth, the throat, the conduit. Clearly, I am no closer to knowing what's at stake than I was 8 years earlier. In the meantime, my writing has turned embarrassingly florid since I'm parroting the theorists I've now been reading for a solid decade. Against my better judgment, I decide that I'm going to write my dissertation on ventriloquism. Against my better judgment, I decide that The Politics of Involuntarity would be a stellar title. I'm 34 and have chosen a different title for my dissertation. It doesn't matter what it is, it only matters that it's less pretentious. I'm in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky on a research trip. As it turns out, there are not a lot of places to conduct archival research on the subject of ventriloquism. In Fort Mitchell, however, there's a museum called Vent Haven that bills itself as the world's only museum dedicated to ventriloquism. Since I'm not a ventriloquist and have never practiced the vaudevillian art of voice throwing or speaking from the belly, though it turns out that ventriloquism is neither of those things, I learned of Vent Haven the way most non-experts do, through a documentary film. The previous year, I wrote a dissertation chapter on the ventriloquist Nina Conti's Her Master's Voice and the Legacy of 6 Bereaved Puppets, in which Conti takes her dead lover's ventriloquist dummies on a transatlantic voyage to Vent Haven, talking to and through them along the journey. Conti deposits the figures at the museum, which she frames as a mausoleum for voiceless puppets, though the museum doesn't represent itself this way. My own writing on Her Master's Voice meditates on the relationship between ventriloquism and documentary film, arguing that actual ventriloquism in the Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy sense, has a lot to tell us about the way documentary, a film form often called ventriloquial, does and doesn't instrumentalize its subjects. My research has taken a literal turn. I used to be interested in ventriloquism as a metaphor. Now I'm interested in talking puppets. So I find myself at Vent Haven, a cluster of buildings in suburban Kentucky, a stone's throw from downtown Cincinnati. Within minutes of my arrival at the compound, I wonder what I'm doing here. The curator, a kind young woman who, along with her husband, teenage kids, and dog, lives on the property, keeps asking me, "What are you looking for exactly?" I keep furnishing vague and unsatisfactory replies like, "Well, I heard this was the place to go, so..." Despite her friendliness, I can tell that the curator is suspicious of me. I already know this actually because it was so difficult to get permission to visit the museum in the first place. When I initially contacted them, they asked for a detailed account of my project and stipulated that I would have to pay them a total of $960 to spend 3 days in residence. Improbably, I managed to secure grant money to cover this exorbitant fee, which I assumed was typical until seasoned friends told me they'd visited some of the most prominent archives in the world for exponentially less money, if there were fees at all. But Vent Haven is not an esteemed place, at least not by normal standards. And while I'm there, I begin to understand that its lack of esteem, in fact, explains the cost of the visit. Ventriloquism, the uncanny, because painfully literal, art of contorting one's vocal organs such that one can speak without moving one's lips and make one's voice appear to emerge from the moving lips of a usually human figure, and its haven, Vent Haven, are curiosities. To most people, that is. On my first day in Vent Haven, the curator introduces me to a self-described historian of ventriloquism. Over fried pickles, curator and historian explain with some resentment that they must be vigilant about protecting the museum from those who would represent it and its focus as oddities. The historian laments the preconceptions that attend to ventriloquism and ventriloquists. The art and its practitioners are retrograde, creepy, cringeworthy, just plain bad. Puppets are scary and talking puppets are even scarier. The only appropriate place for a ventriloquist act is a horror movie, and so on. I ask him where the stereotype of the bad ventriloquist, or perhaps more resonantly, the perception that all ventriloquism is bad, comes from. He gives me an answer I wasn't expecting. Bad ventriloquists, he tells me, have given ventriloquism a bad name. According to historian and curator, ventriloquism's unskilled practitioners have debased the form. They've turned ventriloquists into punchlines rather than purveyors of jokes, objects rather than subjects. It's ironic. Vent Haven, I soon discover, prohibits its appointment-only visitors from photographing the bulk of its collections for fear that the museum and its subject will be re-stigmatized. As a tourist, I follow the rules. Though I've been given permission to photograph the collections, I don't post any of the images to social media. I post only one picture of myself holding a puppet the museum keeps handy for such sanctioned photo ops. When I put it on social, an old friend shares the post, writing, "OMG, my friend Sarah went to the creepiest place ever." I immediately message him and tell him to take it down. I've been infected by ventriloquial paranoia. The thing is that I don't find ventriloquism, its dummies and its high-pitched voices, creepy. Not as a rule, anyway. What I find disturbing about Vent Haven isn't the curator's house, whose attic is overflowing with correspondence between the museum's founder and ventriloquism enthusiast, William Shakespeare Berger, and various worldwide practitioners of the art, nor is it the temperature-controlled outbuildings that house rows upon rows of glassy-eyed puppets, nor is it the knowledge that the dummies on display have countless brothers and sisters packed away in boxes, little coffins, really, somewhere on the property. What makes me uneasy is the silence, and not in the way you might think. I don't find the quiet funereal, as the ventriloquist Nina Conti depicts it in her documentary about Vent Haven. I'm not a professional ventriloquist, at least not the stage performing kind, so I'm not saddened by the displayed figures' loss of their voices, inaugurated by the deaths of the masters who animated them. After all, wouldn't it be a relief not to be given a voice night after night, not to be made to serve as a conduit for someone else's artfulness, or more likely, failure, not to have to perform a role in a play of someone else's design? No, the silence I'm rocked by resounds most loudly when we walk by a large mechanical Christine Jorgensen doll displayed behind glass, when we traipse through an auditorium full of figures and every few rows sits a minstrel dummy in blackface whose ventriloquist owner was undoubtedly white. When I ask about these bodies and I'm curtly told that was just the style back then. In these parts, but not just in these parts, see the wildly popular, handsomely remunerated ventriloquists Jeff Dunham and Terry Fader. A puppet being a puppet means it's already such a caricature that it can't possibly be a caricature. It can't possibly embody racism, sexism, or transphobia. Here and elsewhere, a dummy's physical separation from its ventriloquist means that the dummy is really someone else, and thus someone else's responsibility. When the ventriloquist wants it to be, that is. And of course, none of ventriloquism's cobbling together of affected voices with fabricated bodies to parody trans women and Black people is the museum's responsibility. Ventriloquism is the ultimate alibi. I'm 39, and I'm writing an essay to accompany a museum exhibition on ventriloquism. So many orifices on display. I have at this point spent years meditating on talking puppets, ventriloquism as a political metaphor, and mediation and as ventriloquism. But this is the first time I've seen the gritones. Designed by the Condorhuasi, the Mapuche, and the Diaguita, the Calima, and the Nariño, indigenous artists of present-day Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, the gritones are said to scream for rain. But it's hard to tell what their open mouths are doing. Are they laughing, crying, taunting? Are they mourning? Are they dialoguing with one another? Are they silently, patiently waiting to be filled? What happens when the rain comes? Listen.